Hello. All you crazy cats out there out in the land of online behaviors. Oh, it's dark out here. It's not dark out here. It's still pretty light. We're not at the point now where when clinic hours starts, it's dark outside. I'm not that far north just yet. But here we are. And we are settling in for an evening of discussing topics ranging from the lightest of banter to flirting to sex and everything in between, as long as it has to do with role-playing. So, that means we got to start off with a disclaimer. Right off the bat, I'm going to say, if you are listening to this some other time and you cannot see the screen, there are disclaimer warnings right up there that says that today discretion is advised. We will be talking and acknowledging the existence of sex. And as a result, we will be not shying away from said topics, although if it gets into anything particularly different, I'll make sure to let you know. I will also give you a disclaimer based on the sound of my voice and everybody who may not be able to see this screen, is that I am a heterosexual, cisgendered, white male. And as a result, I should point out that my views on these things are colored by my own experiences, which may not reflect your experiences. So if you are out there live, I would ask you please to participate in the conversation. And of course, understand that anything that I say should be taken with several heaping tablespoons of your favorite flaky salt sea salt. And anyway, music down 5%. Let's take care of that. Thanks for the subs that are coming in, by the way. That's very appreciated. I guess this is right around the time that we would be getting a bunch of those in, so that is quite kind of you. And yes, sex is an actual thing. That's part of what we're here to discuss, because role-playing started out as a it's the end of September. Yeah, if anybody wants the 20% discount, today's the day to do it. Role-playing originally started kind of what we modernly describe as tabletop role-playing. Started off as an adjunct to wargaming. Whoa, Dio! Dio, thank you so much. There's a couple of names in here that I absolutely recognize, and it's good to see them. It's very kind, including some new ones. And that those are going to be playing. That's definitely going to throw us into a hype train if that hasn't already. Although I can't actually see it, which is a little bit of a frustration on the software that I use. But such is that. Thank you everybody also for the bits. But Dio, that's very, very kind. It's very appreciated. Especially because we actually just re-upped our subscription to Epidemic Sound, who are providing today's soundtrack, titled under Clinic Tracks as Sexy. We're at a level 5? All right, well, that'll do it. Dio just pushed us right past it. Thanks, Craig, as well. Anyway, role-playing started out as an adjunct to wargaming. The idea that you would be, instead of playing an entire army, you'd be playing a singular person. It's actually kind of funny. It's sort of the way that MOBAs like Dota or League of Legends started. It was taking real-time strategy games where you'd control a lot of units, like Warcraft or Starcraft, and then deciding what would it be like if you only had to control one unit instead. And that's basically how role-playing started. But role-playing was based on violence. It was based on war, on the idea that you had combat and that you had to somehow navigate yourself around said combat in order to get to the goal. save the princess, because inevitably back then they were princesses. Destroy the monsters, go for the kingdom. Oh no, this is a bathrobe. This is actually a bathrobe that it's a monogrammed bathrobe even, which of course, because the camera is flipped, it's not gonna look proper. I got this bathrobe for participating in a wedding party for a very dear friend of mine named JT. So it might get a little hot in here though, so I may have to take it off eventually. At any rate, the thing is that violence is something that we've always kind of assumed is part of the role-playing experience for decades. And as role-playing games evolved to incorporate more about storytelling and more about the human condition, there's something that was left off quite a while ago. And that's the ideas of romance, of relationships, and of sex. Not very many games have any rules about these sorts of things until later on in role-playing's lifetime. And even then, it gets a little bit complicated, especially because there were a few products that were released that touched upon the idea, but were played either mostly for humor or were an excuse to attempt to sell softcore pornographic shots, boudoir shots of cosplay, in essence, which, definitely has its audiences, but the rules that accompanied them weren't exactly well thought out. The idea of, instead of sex being treated as a mature subject that we can discuss and make part of our role-playing experiences, it instead ended up being a way for somebody to claim that they could shoot fireballs out of their genitals. So that is the way things go for that. Yes, Kung Fu Fenris knows the title. It was the Book of Erotic Fantasy, and that was a book designed for D&D 3rd edition. And of course, then we can also get into jokes such as the exalted April Fool's joke. But at any rate. Yeah, it was 3.0. Yeah, Rule 34. There is no Rule 34 art that exists of certain things I've worked on, and that pleases me. The Scroll of Swallowed Darkness, Craigod, you're absolutely correct. That is what we have. But I asked originally on our Discord whether there was any questions that people had, and we had a lot of really good ones. So we're actually going to start with those and see if we can prompt that in terms of conversation and then move forward with this. But I will say right off the bat that if role-playing is the kind of thing that you do in order to roll dice, hit monsters, take treasure, level up, there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that being your experience in terms of role-playing. There is no judgment on this, or on this end at least, because if that's the kind of game you want to play, that's the kind of game you should play, and nobody should stop you from doing that. In much the same way, if what you want to do when you're role-playing is to examine the human condition, even if you're not necessarily playing a human at all, then it is worth considering whether you want to add the ideas of relationships or sex into your game. So let's have a look at the questions that we got, and we will call them up. But I think there's definitely one that I got to start with, which is Ellie Spot, who's asking, what are some good reasons to include sex in RPGs? What kind of topics can it open up, besides from the sex itself? How can it be used to describe or explore characters, again, besides the pure sexy stuff? How can it be used to tell a story? My main thought is a lot of times we focus on that sex is a hard topic, or how to include its safety aspects. I'd like to hear some thoughts on why we may choose to include it in the first place. So, right off the bat, I am going to mention that all of my games that I play in, whether I'm a player or whether I am running it, will have to essentially include enough safety tools to make sex safe, including the red rule, which states that any attempt to have your character put into a sexual situation that you don't want automatically fails, and the idea of being able to establish lines, veils, consent, and all that. But this isn't a stream about safety in and of itself. It will definitely come in as we discuss this, but we're going to get that out of the way because, as this question is pointing out, when we talk about sex, often what we're doing is we're going to the negatives of it, going to the, well, where should we stop? What is the limit? How far can we go? Do we have to have this? And instead, I want to shift why we're looking at it from another perspective. Why would we want to have this in our game? What could we do to make this an interesting part of our gaming experience? How can it enrich what we're doing? And what are the reasons? So, Elisabeth, I have to say, I adore this question because I think that a lot of people, in much the same way that I think personally that when we teach sex in schools, we do an awful lot of teaching anatomy. We do an awful lot potentially about teaching about the dangers of sex. We don't do as good a job of teaching about things like consent or the idea of enthusiastic consent. And what we definitely don't do is we don't talk about the pleasures of sex and why someone would want to have sex, and to explain what the point is of sexual encounters. Because I think if we kind of knew why we wanted to do it, then we would be better prepared to advocate for ourselves going forward. Because sex is definitely a way in which people can be taken advantage of or even just disappointed. And so it is an idea that we should progress with as well. So, reasons that we can include sex in games. The first reason that I'd point out, first and foremost, is that it is part of our human condition. It is something that a lot of people, not all people, but a lot of people will encounter in their lives, and potentially more than life or death combat, it's a part of who we are. One could say that there's a biological imperative for us to go out and breed, but I don't think that that's really the point here. The point is that sex is one of the ways in which we express love and relationships, and we will kind of incorporate relationship talk into all of this as well. Sex tends to be the eye-catching topic, so sometimes it goes first. But what I would say is that it is one of the things that we encounter in our lives today. It's one of the ways in which we express ourselves at our most vulnerable. And in some ways that is a highlight of who we are when the masks fall away. There obviously is an intimacy that is involved with sex. Hey, thanks for the follow. Very appreciated, Eddie Sassery. When we are engaged in intimate behavior, and I will also point out that for the purposes of today's discussion, sex does not mean your standard, tab A into slot B. That is what sex is. If there isn't penetration, if there isn't one penis and one vagina, then it isn't sex. That's absolutely not the case. Sex is widely varied on a huge spectrum. What counts as sex is huge as well. So that's where we are. New last August. We've been here for over a year, I'm afraid. I find that the moments of intimacy that we can explore can be just as interesting and just as fulfilling as the moments of strife or stress that someone can see. You'll find in LARP play often, but also in some tabletops, that people take great pride in their ability to stand up and shout and express big emotions like anger and fury and crying. I've seen people who believe that if they shed tears in the middle of a role-playing game, then they have somehow won role-playing. I mean, this is also a thing about actors. Some actors can turn the waterworks on and believe that makes them excellent actors, and it's not always the same thing. But sex, while sex can be big, sex is also incredibly potent. It is a moment that can be pivotal in your character's existence, and how they react to intimacy is often something that I think is worth examining. I'll also point out that the idea of examining sex is in some ways a way for us to explore in a safe, controlled, fun environment that can be, assuming that you're taking the proper precautions, relatively low stakes. I am not necessarily advocating for everybody to be like, well, I'm going to describe sex up into and including every individual thrust until completion and afterwards. But I do think that you can learn a lot just by engaging in that kind of intimate play in much the same way that you can learn about all other aspects of just being in the situations that you find yourself in role-playing. I cannot, in fact, I have lost track of the number of players that I've had over the years, back when I was running live action games. The number of times where I had players come in who wanted to experiment with different genders, different sexualities, both, to a degree that for some of them, it was, I'm interested to see how it is for someone who is not me, which is what a lot of role-playing is. I am not strong. I wish to roleplay someone who is strong. I am not charismatic. I wish to roleplay somebody who is. I am not, insert anywhere on the gender of sexuality or gender, but I want to see what someone else is. And you can learn by playing that part. You can't necessarily say that you have all the experience that you need at that point. You cannot know what it is to be X simply through role-playing, but you can certainly gain more of an insight, more of an understanding as you go through by seeing it from another perspective. The other thing that I have noticed as well in my time are people who use role-playing to test out who they really are, a way that they can bring forward a part of themselves that they may or may not be embarrassed to share with the world, or even they may not feel safe to share. I have at various times had the privilege of being a storyteller as someone examines what it would be like to engage in a same-sex relationship, or to engage in a relationship at all that they had not previously considered. And then weeks, months, even years later, to find out that this was one of the steps that they took to accept themselves fully as who they are. And it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, that there are ways to play in a simulation in order to get better at something else. We will do practice runs. We will rehearse for a play. We will, the armies will use virtual spaces or create virtual spaces around them to practice tactics. Role-playing is a way for us to test out our social IQ, our emotional IQ, although IQ sucks, but anyway, even something as simple as talking to somebody knowing that you do not have to risk your own heart or your own sense of social well-being or your reputation can be huge. And since sex is something that a lot of people hold very, very dear to themselves, being able to do it in the context of a game is a way to practice that. It's also fun. For some people, sex is an embarrassing topic, something that they can't talk about openly, something that they can't talk about without blushing. I mean, I can't talk about it without turning red, but that's just because that's me and I'm in a warm-ass bathrobe. But I think that there is some value in showing people that you can have fun with sex just as much as you can have fun with anything else. As much as it's something that we do have to be careful with, obviously, there are plenty of consequences with sex and there's plenty of ways to get hurt. But it is also something that at its core can be an important part of your expression of love, an important part of your expression of joy, of physical joy, emotional joy, spiritual joy for some. And to destigmatize sex in that way can be a huge boon and a huge benefit. And finally, of identity as well. Absolutely, Kung Fu Fenris. And it's a topic that we often treat with a lot of seriousness, but we shouldn't necessarily. You could also make the argument that role-playing can do for sex what the romance novel did. A lot of people look down on romance novels. Okay, this is getting way too hot. Sorry. It was interesting to start, but like it is hot in this room and I can't open my window at the moment because there's noise outside. So there we go. Just have to deal with me taking my clothes off on stream. Romance novels were originally written as a way for female empowerment. I know that it seems that people, giggle behind themselves about trashy novels with sex written in them, but they were often some of the only books which presented sex as something that women wanted, that women could enjoy, that the characters themselves were, instead of the prize to be won, were actively seeking things on their own. And that encouraged a generation of women to look at sex as not a responsibility or a duty that they had to perform, but something that they could seek out on their own terms, for their own pleasure and their own well-being. And I think that role-playing can play the same role, not necessarily only for women, but for everybody. To get the idea that you can engage in a healthy sexual relationship with somebody, but also know that at the end of the session, you can stand up, shake hands, grin about what's going on, and then leave is fine. Look at the most recent episode that we put out of Exalt Academy, and I will provide some spoilers in here for people who haven't watched it. You won't have to stay away for very long, but you might want to mute me for the next 30 seconds. I'll give you a thumbs up when we're ready to come back from it. But in the last episode of Exalt Academy, we had for the first time in our online stream history, we had two PCs start to express themselves physically towards each other. Didn't necessarily go all the way, as some would put it, but it was an interesting moment. But we were sitting there grinning like idiots. It was wonderful for us to do this because honestly, romance and sex are fun. So why not? Just go for it. And anyway, I'll throw the thumbs up because we'll come back to that if we need to, but we don't have to keep discussing that. So I'm going to throw it out to the chat at this point while we're kind of talking about this. Do you have any specific reasons why you want to bring sex into it? There's fascinating studies that you can read out there about the idea of people going online and role-playing in games such as Second Life, although these days it's often games more like VR chat, where people would assume another identity in order to have the freedom for sexual play, away from the restrictions or from the societal judgment that otherwise they may endure as a result. So role-playing has been doing this for a long time, and I think it will continue. But I will say, of course, it is optional in much the same way that you don't have to role-play games where there's violence in them. You don't have to role-play games where there's sex in them. And if you're uncomfortable with this topic and do not wish to address it or confront it, you shouldn't have to. It's that simple as well. Kung Fu Fenris says, fun fact, I wrote an erotical novel in my early 20s. Best way to describe it is a bodice ripper, self-published on Amazon. It sold well, but it actually sold best in the more commonly conservative parts of the world. All of the feedback from readers were from femme readers. Sexual empowering media is an important tool. And then follows it up with, I think RPGs are in the same corner, and I agree. I think that empowering people, letting them have agency over their own sexuality in a way that they can do so safely and in an environment where they are in control, can be a lot of help for a lot of people. And there is also a certain part of if you're the sort of person who really likes to dig deep in your characters to find out what they are all about, why they do what they do, sex is going to be one aspect of that. It's a big chunk of someone's life. You might not want to miss it. Requiem says, honestly, for me, sex and relationships are just a natural part of life, so it just seems natural to me, at least, to include it. I mean, we could also say that, defecation is a natural part of life, but we don't necessarily include those in our role-playing games. But I do agree that it is a healthy part of our interaction with others, and that's kind of what role-playing is all about. So Luke says, because I'm lonely in real life and get to live vicariously through virtual or witnessed fictional relationships. That's also a case. There is one element of this that I am leaving out, which I probably shouldn't. Just because it doesn't necessarily apply to me doesn't mean that it can't apply to somebody else. There are people who get genuine sexual satisfaction out of role-playing sex. And I am of the opinion that if you are consenting in this, if that's what you want to do, and the people who you're role-playing with are also happy to do it, then go for it. That's just fine. I am not here to police or judge what you do on your own time. Your own erotic imagination and your own erotic life are yours. And as long as you are not harming somebody by including them unwittingly or unwillingly in that, go nuts. Do what you wish. Now, I don't do this. I'm at a stage in my life at this point where I do not seek out sexual encounters through role-playing for sexual gratification. I'm more interested in the emotional aspects of it. I am more interested in the as experimenting and experiencing different styles of play, of different ways of people expressing intimacy. All of that is fun and interesting and fascinating to me, but I don't do it for jollies. I'm not saying that you might not out there, but it is something also to keep in mind. And I think that you do have to remember to a certain degree that you also cannot control what somebody does in the privacy of their own lives. So obviously, if the idea of you engaging in any of this kind of sexual play and knowing that somebody else may derive thrills from this, that is something that if it bothers you, then you may not wish to engage in these sorts of things. So that also comes into play. So I'm trying to be sex positive about this as well. I'm not trying to squick anybody out. But it is absolutely something that people can do, and I personally don't think that there's a problem with it as long as boundaries are set, and as long as you also understand that just because you do something in private doesn't mean you have to let other people know. Somebody may consent to engaging in sexual role play with you, but doesn't want to know that you are then incorporating elements of that sexual role play into your own personal sex life. And I think that informing them that you are doing so is involving them in your sex life, which is crossing a boundary that you may want to cross, but a lot of people will not. So just use discretion. The Loracular writes, when I started RPing online in 1995, there were a lot of things I did in regards to sex or sexuality that I would never touch in public now, especially without safety tools. But the internet was brand new, and if I say we didn't know better at the time, that is sincere. And I think that's absolutely sincere. Look, I would be willing to wager that there are a lot of people out there who have done unsafe things on the internet and unsafe things in role-playing. I know I have. It's not like I've been using safety tools my entire life. But we also can't kind of beat ourselves up over it, right? Their intent and the like still matter. And I think that there's also a shame that people carry with them with this that I don't think is necessary. That's a personal belief of mine, but sex is too awesome to carry this much stigma around it. As long as we keep in mind always that we have to do so in a consensual, safe manner for all involved. But there is that. Kung Fu Fender says, RPGs and LARPs have helped me to address my own sexuality in a lot of ways, mostly to solidify it through new experiences that I found a safe group to learn with. And that has been my experience as well, just in terms of the number of people who I've played with. And honestly, the number of people who have told me specifically, oh yeah, I did this in your game because I was secretly or quietly X and wanted to learn more about it without coming out, which I think is, honestly, that's fine. Again, as long as you're not using games for therapy, that's something else, and you probably need to consult professionals for that, right? You don't necessarily want to enter into a role-playing game and then to take all of what is bothering you and then just project it onto the game and onto everybody else and expect them to accept your emotional baggage. But I think that there's absolutely ways that you can engage in sexual play without this necessarily coming up that way. So, Craig Odd's got a great line here. Why include sexuality? Playing a character with confidence and pride. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. So Luke says, a good example of that was in LARPs, where one party thought the other wanted her to stay in character, so went along with it, even though she didn't want to. So you're talking about the web series that I wrote. I'm not going to say you're wrong if that's how you interpreted it. It's not how I intended to write it. But you know, like it belongs to the audience now. It doesn't belong to me. The idea, of course, always at that point is just to make sure that people are consenting. And one thing that I will say is that in LARPs, no one had sex without consent. So there is that as well. All right. So let's get on to the next question, which sort of, as long as people feel like we've covered that element of it, I'm still looking at your answers. If you think that I need to see something and I didn't catch it the first time around, just send it again. I'm happy to go back to it. So Elispod also asked, another thing I've been thinking about is how you pick a good point to fade to black. What all parties are comfortable with is one thing, but are there other things to take into account? And how do you communicate about which point is comfortable for everyone involved? So this is the idea and concept of fade to black. Fade to black, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the idea that you start a scene, that you imply that a scene is going to continue, and that, like in a television show, you fade to black in order to indicate that time continues to pass, but you don't get to see what happens. This is often if you are engaged in a game, if you're watching a movie or a television show, two characters start to get hot and heavy, but we don't want to see the result of their being hot and heavy. You don't actually want to witness the sexual act beyond that point. So we fade out. And this is one of the things that, I missed the hype train. But this is one of the things that we also see in role-playing games. The idea that like two characters are like, okay, so I guess they're going to do it, right? Yeah, they're going to do it. Okay, so fade to black? Fade to black, yeah. And then you move on. This is a way to incorporate sex into your games without necessarily saying, and then he put his passion eggplant into his eager, lips of yearning, and we don't necessarily need to get into that, depending on the level of sexuality that you're comfortable with in your game. There are people out there who will roleplay the whole thing. This is very common among people who engage in cyber sex, where they will just straight up describe the entire sex act from the beginning to the end. But a lot of roleplaying doesn't necessarily go quite that far. But there are ways to balance the idea of when a fade to black should happen. If you say, okay, so my character leans towards you. Okay, well, my character closes her eyes. All right, fade to black. Like before any physical contact is made. I have seen players who that's their level of comfort. I've seen players who also won't go forward because they're too worried that everyone else is going to be grossed out or embarrassed by what's happening, when in reality everybody would be fine or even eager to continue on to see what's happening. The idea of describing two characters engaged in a kiss, and then if you immediately say fade to black, well, what you're also doing is you're cutting out the idea of what does the character think about that kiss? How does the character react to that kiss? Maybe one of the players is like, well, I only ever intended for it to get as far as a single kiss and that's it. But now you've said fade to black. And so I guess the assumption is that they're having sex now. There's still elements that I wanted to check before that was going to happen. Or there could be moments about the sexual dynamic which you want to explore. Maybe one of the characters is in a more dominant or submissive place in that relationship, and you'd like to see what that would be like, how they would interact. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it up to and through the entire act, but fading to black too early robs you of the ability to continue to play in that space. But it's a balancing act, as it always is. In much the same way that I can say, okay, so the characters stride through the throne room, they meet with the king gives them their mission, the characters thank the king, there's a banquet, lots of merriment is had, and then the party finds themselves outside the castle the following day, ready with a map to show where their next adventure is going to take them. We could do that. But there are players out there who'd be like, well, I want to talk to the king. I would like a chance to meet the queen. What is being served at the tables? I would like a chance to have my character sing a ballad. I'm going to try to dance with everyone at the thing. When the party is over, my character is going to pass out underneath the table. All of these little details, for some players, that's what they want. That's what they want to go for. And summing it up is robbing them of that chance. And the same happens with relationships and sex. You don't have to roleplay everything, but there's definitely elements that people may want to roleplay. Right. As Kate is putting right here, Gala? We can't just gloss over that. And there are people who would say the same thing about sex itself. So how do you gauge this? Well, first and foremost, if you've had a session 0, which you should have, then people will have their lines and veils that they can reveal. But the lines and veils are only part of the story, because I might say, okay, well, nobody's going to describe penetration in this game, so I'm not even going to bother mentioning it, or it doesn't occur. And then somebody comes along in the game and says, all right, so your fingers go where now? And I'm like, whoa, that's way too much. So you can't necessarily rely on lines and veils to support you right away. If you know that you want to make sex a part of your game, you can be explicit about it. You can say right up front, this is something that I want to talk about. This is something that I want to be part of the game. Are you okay with it? To what degree are you okay with it? And then you'll have players who will describe what they want or think they want to answer. Because here's another thing, a lot of us have very internalized thoughts about how we should interact with sex. Some of us will immediately come right out and say, well, I don't want to talk about sex at all, because we're conditioned to think that we shouldn't talk about sex. And there are other people who will say, well, I'm okay with whatever you're okay with, because we are conditioned to go with the flow and do what our partners want to do. And not wonderful, right? Neither situation is great. Erring on the side of caution is generally a good idea, but it's something that we have to deal with. So where we end up then is if you know that sex is going to be part of your game, you may have to dig deeper before it happens at the beginning, but also be aware that you're going to have to adjust that barometer as you play. Because you may also find that someone who initially says, I'm not comfortable with this, might be the one who then initiates it later on, realizing that they can let their guard down, they're in a safer place, or they're just getting excited about what's happening to their character and eager to find out what happens next. To go back to the original question, which is, how do we know when we should fade to black? Sometimes the answer is you do it over multiple sessions. You find out what the limits are for you and for the other people at your table by having open communication at the end of your sessions. That aftercare is essential. It's important to talk about what happened at game, to bring people back into the real world. I know it seems like it's, well, that seems like a lot of effort to make. Like, that seems like a big deal. Why are we taking so much time focusing on a game like it's just a game? But in reality, you'll have more fun if you do it this way. I guarantee it. And then you're encouraging an environment where players are able to openly express what they like and what they don't like. Because any decent person out there will not want to cause people discomfort at a table. If I was role-playing with somebody and we had role-played a sexual encounter up to a certain point, and then that person afterwards said, hey, you know what? I didn't say it at the time, but I would be more comfortable going further, then I know if I have a good relationship with that player, we have our safety tools in place, we are comfortable being able to discuss our boundaries and needs, then I can tell them, yes, I'm willing to go further, or I'm comfortable where we were, or in fact, in the future, I'd like to go a little less. All of these are fine. It's kind of open communication that you have to do, because for a topic like this, especially a topic where people come in already loaded with baggage, it's going to have to come apart slowly and carefully. I know how much I can push with my players currently, but I also know that the amount that I can push depends on the day, and it can depend on whether somebody just feels good or not. Maybe somebody, shows up to game, they've got a fantastic outfit on, they just got a haircut, they're feeling really good about themselves, and they're like, I feel confident and ready, let's go. Let's talk about slam jamming all day long. But you could also have somebody who comes in and says, I don't know, I'm not feeling well today. I definitely don't feel very sexy at all because I'm uncomfortable and kind of in pain. I just don't want to get into it today. Because my own physical revulsion to the idea of sex today means that I'm not going to be able to enjoy it if that's what's being discussed in roleplay. And that's fine too. So you have to establish that baseline right off the bat of this is what we expect, and this is what we would like. Expect basically being where the hard limits are. And then you have to basically go through it and tease it out. Because I can also say that I have faded to black and then have the person be like, okay, so let's fade to black, but you should know this about what would happen afterwards. Okay, well then you should know this. Well then you should know this. And then essentially the rest of the scene is played out just with an added layer of removal. What would be an example of this? So if I described, for instance, all right, my character, Alice, is going to have sex with Bob. Okay, should we fade to black? Great, we'll fade to black. But just so that you know, Alice is kind of tentative, but then as soon as the lights go out, she just goes for it. She's in it. Once the lights are out, she is absolutely willing and ready to do any kind of crazy request that's made of her. And then Bob's player can be like, all right, well, okay, so, when the lights go out and she starts offering crazy stuff, he just gives in to his wildest fantasies. He makes it a night to remember. And that's different because you've added an extra layer of separation from your character, but you're still exploring how your character can react and act and and make things different in the context of your game. It means that you are still describing a sex act, but instead of describing every individual moan, you are saying, this is how my character would react in this moment, because then you can decide when to fade back in. Is it immediately after the act is finished? Pillow talk, lying next to each other, cuddling on the bale of hay that they just soiled? Or is it like the next morning they look at each other and secretly they're very happy with what happened the previous night because they both went places that they never thought they'd go to in the first place. Like, that's important information for some players to find out what their characters are like and what their characters would want to continue doing. But as Elliespot says, which I think is a great way of putting it, fading to black and then talking more general about what happens, you get the dynamics, but without making it borderline pornographic. And I think that that's kind of a limit of what pornographic is and whether you want to get pornographic. That sort of is a catch-all term, because pornography isn't something that's easily defined. If you show me a photograph of a naked man, I can't tell you if it's pornographic or not until I see it and in the context that it's presented to me, what's going on in the photograph, and my limits for what I would consider pornographic might not be the same as yours. And that's a balance that you have to find with your players. But adding that level of separation in there, that's also a way to be able to talk about things and find out where everyone's limits are, with adding that extra cushion that if you describe, like, my character would totally be into feet, say, and I really want to, and the other person's like, well, like, what do you mean about feet? Like, tell me, show me what you mean. Show me what your character is asking about feet. This is a way for you to sort of say, okay, well, we're taking it out. We're going to talk about this still in the context of role-playing, and then we can go back in if we want, if we need to. Or if you're like, oh, they're into feet, well, then 2 days later in game, when this happens again, it could be next session, it could be 3 sessions from now. If it's a mass online game, this could happen 5 minutes later for all I know. Then you might be like, well, okay, we can talk about how my character touches your character's feet. That would be interesting. Let's do that. And at that point, you start playing it out anyway, because now there's a level of safety of being like, okay, well, I know what's going on with the feet. I'm comfortable with the feet. This is fine. I'm okay with this. It's like testing the waters. But it is something that you just have to be conscious of as you're doing it, because also remember, one day somebody might be like, I'm sitting alone here. I'm ready to I'm ready to talk about the whole damn thing. Let's go for it. I am essentially, let's have cyber sex right here and now. And the next day they could be like, I just don't want to do it. And it's just like consent. It could be given, it could be taken away. So Kate brings up something. I was hoping that somebody would bring this up. This is something that intimacy directors offer for staged sex. In film, you choreograph what the actors are comfortable with that day. But on stage, you need to be able to adjust based on your comfort each performance. And this makes this creates an excellent point, and a point that we're going to get into, and it's actually probably a good segue to this. There are actors out there who might be like, you know what, I'm comfortable. Roll me out on stage. I will roll around with this other actor. I will, simulate sex with them, no problem. And then you say, great. At tonight's performance, your entire extended family are here. They're all very conservative, and they're going to watch you. And all of a sudden, you might be like, I don't know if I'm comfortable getting naked and rolling around with somebody else on stage. It used to be fine, but now my mother is watching me. And this can make a big difference about what you're doing. Your audience does affect how you are playing. And if your audience is affected by it, then it's much the same way as if you are gaming, because you have everyone else who's gaming with you, who are witnessing what's going on. And then Kate also mentions in stage fights, there's a safe word. It gets used. The fight amounts to, haha, I win, and all the weapons or wrestling or whatever ends, which is true. Anytime I've choreographed a fight in my entire career, there's always a safe word. And it's great when you do this with like teenagers, because you make the safe word a swear word, and then you get them to practice it because they have to say the swear word every time you start practicing the stage fights, and they're all gleeful about shouting. Typically the word that I use is bastard. They all just shout out bastard, and then you're like, great, okay, and then you move on, and they all love it. But yeah, they have safe words, because if you slip, if you notice your weapon is broken, if you pull a hamstring or whatever, you don't want to continue with something that could be potentially unsafe. Intimacy choreography kind of needs the same thing. And it's almost akin to a safe word in terms of, like, say, a sexual act, or if you're engaged in BDSM play. Kind of similar. It's not exactly the same. But that is something that you that you have. Kate mentions we have safety cards at our table and in our Discord game, which are an amazing way to gauge consent. It is something that's important, because I'll remind people. I'm going to go grab my cards. Can I? If you're engaged in a sexual situation in play and everybody's just doing... If you're engaged in a sexual situation at play and everybody's flashing green cards all day, every day, then you can be pretty sure that you can keep going. But one of the things about our particular safety system is that if somebody flashes a yellow card, they're not saying stop. They're saying there's something that you need to know. And if I flash this up and I'm like, hey, so just so you know, I definitely want to keep going, but I don't want it to get any more explicit than this, then what we have to train ourselves to know is me flashing a yellow is not, hey, you need to back off or back down. It's, hey, there's something you just need to know about what's going on. We just need to take a moment to stop and discuss something. That's what this is for. Because our stop card, our red card, this is a I'm not okay card. We can't, like, I have to stop. And one of the things that the reason why we have this pause card, our yellow card, as an advantage for our system, in our opinion, obviously use the safety system that you think is best for you, is that I want the ability to show a yellow card to be like, no, I don't think that there's a problem here, but I definitely just want to make sure that we're not going to have a problem here. And for people to get used to the idea that flashing a card does not mean you have done something wrong. I would be horrified if I found out that I was playing with somebody and then after the fact, they were telling everybody else but not me, oh, he was such a jerk. He was role-playing sex with me and I felt all icky and gross and like I felt used, and then the person didn't actually come and tell me. I would feel horrible, first of all, because I'd want to make sure that I had enthusiastic consent before doing that in the first place. But second, because I never want to make anybody feel badly. So the idea of being able to use the safety cards and in such a way that it's like, no, it's cool, it's casual, I'm not judging you, I'm just making sure that I'm advocating for myself, is really handy for that sort of thing. So if you're going to do sex, use your safety cards. This isn't even like, hey, if you're going to have sex with somebody, you should consider using condoms. Like, absolutely, you should consider using condoms all the time. But like, I wouldn't ever role play sex unless I had a safety system in place. Just at all. Ever. There's no such thing as like, well, we're fluid bonded. No. Cards are there. Got to keep them on the table. So the concept of sex matters in terms of everyone else at the table there too. And this can matter, especially if you are like our group, which is something that we discussed at the end of the last session, whereby our gaming group that we play on Sundays, we're two couples. We are couples that have been together for a long period of time. We are couples that live together. And these are serious long-term relationships. Now, what does that mean for your game if you are worried about how other people are going to react? Well, first thing you can do is you can talk to people and you can ask. Sometimes addressing it is the easiest and fastest way to just make sure that things are going to be okay. Hey, so just so that you know, in games that I play in, romance comes up, sex comes up. Is that going to be an issue for anybody? Especially, like, how would you feel if I hit on you? But also, how would you feel if I hit on your partner who's sitting right over there? You can be open about this. Not everybody is willing to discuss this openly, though. That's something that you are going to have to keep in mind. But that's why you can also, you start the conversation in general terms, and then you can get more specific if you have to. But it is something to keep in mind. We are also, admittedly, professionals. And we're professionals who have had to watch our respective partners engaged in sexual acts, although sexual acts of varying levels of intensity. I'm including kissing somebody as a sexual act in this. We've had to watch each other engage in these sorts of things in the context of work. So we're kind of inured to it to a certain degree. And not only do we at a certain point say like, well, it's part of our professional lives, but also, well, this is something that we can still enjoy the process of creating a story or creating art and separating our sexual lives from it as well. I have had to kiss people on camera before and on stage. I've had to simulate sex, albeit in a exaggerated, like not realistic sense personally. I've had to do that on stage. I've had to appear mostly nude on stage before. This is something that I'm used to. But I also make sure that I consult, right? I talk to my partner. I would like to think that you would do that too, just to find out what's going on. Because I'll also point out that not everybody is involved in a monogamous long-term relationship. Short-term relationships, relationships that involve more than one partner, relationships that involve thruples or quadruples where everybody is involved with everybody. Some that where it's you have your paramours and your metamours and your long-term partners and your primaries and your secondaries. There's a huge range of all these things that exist across the board. So I cannot possibly anticipate your exact relationship situation. I can say that it is worth talking to people about this. Because I wouldn't want to hit on Scott if I knew that Scott would be uncomfortable with it. And I wouldn't want to hit on Scott if I knew that Elizabeth or Kate would be uncomfortable with it as well. And finally, and perhaps just as importantly, or definitely just as importantly, I wouldn't want to hit on Scott if I didn't think that I was comfortable with it as well. So there are elements that we have to be careful and cautious of. I have encountered people who say that they would be incredibly jealous if they ever saw their partner with somebody else, even in the context of a role-playing game. And I have encountered people who are like, I genuinely get excited if I see my partner engage with someone else in terms of a role-playing game. It turns me on. I am not talking about anybody specific that you know of, just for what it's worth. All of my examples today I'm pulling from vagueness. They're either completely fabricated or involve other people, or I've had permission to tell the story. So just so that you know. Also, don't try to read into my own sexual preferences. I told you at the top of the show, cishet, white dude, and I'm not into feet. But anyway, not that it would be wrong if I was. So let's see. So Kung Fu Fenders makes a very good point. I still place the idea that RPGs, by their nature, is unscripted and a bit more immersive, and it can create a different set of issues than acting. I don't agree. But the thing is, I think you're correct to a certain point, but I think that it depends on the kind of acting that people are doing. There's an absolute reason why you hear a lot about people who cheat on their partners or engage in relationships because people starred together in a movie or worked together on a play. It can be immersive. Acting, depending on the kind of acting you're doing, can be just as or more immersive than role-playing. But it does follow the same thing. It's just that for your average person who is not a professional actor, role-playing is as close as they get to that immersion. So yes, it absolutely is something to keep in mind. And they don't have the professional layer of removal that they can have for that. Bleed is absolutely a thing. And the idea of it being immersive means that people are perhaps likelier to be uncomfortable or to engage in riskier behavior. So there are ways that this can end up being an issue. Requiem says, I think in online mass games, being able to step out of character and laugh about what is going on with the other player and talk about the role-playing implications or what have you helps keep it within the context of the game and can help ease a lot of uncomfortableness about it. It makes me more comfortable to explore relationships in an online role-playing venue, at least. Yes. I'll also point out, though, that for some people, just be a little bit careful. It's fine to laugh. It's fine for everybody to, raise their half-second glasses and, giggle over what's happening. That's fine. But remember that for some people, when they are role-playing, they treat it a little more seriously than that. And they may not appreciate someone laughing because this can be misinterpreted. It could be that somebody perhaps is role-playing a same-sex relationship for the very first time because they're testing it out. They want to know what it feels like because they suspect that this might be what they want in real life. And then afterwards you laugh and you're like, ha ha ha, oh, ain't that stupid, two guys getting together. I mean, obviously don't do that either because it's just being homophobic, and don't do that. But just be a little bit careful. Laughter can sometimes be misinterpreted. That being said, creating a light atmosphere where people can enjoy themselves definitely can go a long way to dispersing that tension. Like squirting dish soap on top of water to make sure that you break that surface tension of the water itself and things can't float on it as easily. So I guess I'm just saying, just be a little bit careful. I definitely wouldn't want, for instance, in Disconcordia, for people to stop laughing about the various sexual things that are happening at any one point in time in that game. I would just say that in terms of, like, if you are in a more private one-on-one game or a game at a table, and then people just start laughing at your sexual escapades, some people will take that seriously. And it may not be immediately obvious. But it is a way, being able to, in an online game, both communicate in character and out of character because of the duality of where it is, that can make a big difference. So it helps. So Kung Fu Fenris says, you don't get to rehearse an intimacy scene in a role-playing game, but yes, it has a different setup. You don't always get, you should be able to rehearse an intimacy scene in film or plays. Sometimes you don't. It shouldn't be done. But I would say that you do get to rehearse intimacies in role-playing games if you have a decent session zero and if you talk about it beforehand. If you make sure that you know what's going to happen. And if you have the safety cards, even though you can't necessarily rehearse, you have tools to help you. But you have to be willing to use those tools and used to using these tools. We ourselves, when we first started using safety tools, there were times where someone's like, I wanted to pull a card and then I didn't because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to cause a... So that's part of the reason why our green card... Sorry, let's hold the green card that you can actually see. It's part of the reason why our green card is so important because it gets people used to using the tools. It's also part of the reason why when we hold up yellows now, we don't hesitate to throw up yellows as much as we once did because we also realize that sometimes you're just throwing it up to say like, hey, this is just getting heavy. Is everybody okay? Okay, great. Well, now we're used to using the yellow, so it helps. Ellie says, but it could be good to let the people involved in the scene be the people to start laughing about it. I think that once you kind of like, if it's somebody's first time that you see it sort of happening, it's worth it to sort of be like, okay, let's just test the waters here. But if you've seen it happen more than once, there is such a thing as implied consent, and it does actually exist in role-playing as well. If I've role-played with you and you're like, it's totally fine if you have a character like hit me with a bat, well, I might not ask you the second time because I'm like, well, I assume that the consent is still there. But consent, remember, can also be revoked at any time. If you are totally fine with people joking about your character, we don't necessarily have to ask every single time. The consent is implied, but we do have the tools to make sure that somebody can revoke that consent at any time. This is what it would look like if I was holding up our normal green card. You can't see it because it's being color keyed out, which is why we have a different card here. I'll actually show you if you want to see, just because I think it's fun. So if I turn off the chroma key, our normal safety card is very similar to the green that's behind me. And this card is more blue, but we can kind of fake that it's green. Kinda. So that's how that goes. We've lost the music. Come back, music. So here's another point which is actually quite important. Luke says, I don't think I could roleplay a romance in real time, as I'd get attached to the person behind the character probably and forget it's roleplay. It's what's known as bleed. It happens to a lot of people. And as much as Luke followed up by saying, but then I'm neurodivergent and have boundary confusion issues, you're not alone, and there are a lot of people out there who may not be considered neurodivergent who have the exact same thing. I have witnessed it personally. It is an absolute thing that somebody will start role-playing, get really attached in the middle of a romance, and then genuinely feel these rushes of emotion when it comes to this relationship, and then feel awful when that relationship inevitably does not transfer to real life. Because one of the things about role-playing is that we play in order to feel things in a safe context. When we experience victory, we get that rush of adrenaline and endorphins. When we engage in romance online, there is absolutely a part of your body that responds because you are playing through the story and the emotion. It's the same thing that you'll get when somebody watches television or reads a book or goes to see a play. You see two people kiss and fall in love, and your body will respond to that physically. And there are people out there for whom that physical response or that emotional response is too great. Being able to identify that that's something that you don't think you'd be able to handle shows a lot of maturity. And I think that it's important for you to recognize that, because I don't want to break your heart. And I also don't want to get involved with the idea that the person I'm playing with, I'll have to break their heart as well. It is a thing, but it's also the same way that if you have rage issues and every time your character failed, you snap your pencil in half and you flip the pizza that you ordered across the room, you probably shouldn't play games then either. At least not until you can bring your anger under control. So there are definitely people out there for whom they'll have to draw a line or a veil at romance, let alone sex. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that this is not something that you want to or that you should engage with in the context of a role-playing game. Most of our quotes are horny quotes. Let's be very honest with ourselves. So Kung Fu Fenrir says boundary confusion issues can happen with everyone. I've had a lot of RPG relationships that broke my heart. Yeah. I am involved in any number of role-playing relationships right now. Just go watch Exalted Academy. You'll see. But they bring me levels of enjoyment based on the idea of like, I'm telling a cool story, and this is a story that I think is neat and to explore. But it is absolutely possible to make somebody feel badly or sad by doing something in a role-playing game. Watch Exalted Nexus. Go watch episode 20 and tell me that we didn't have players who just were upset. Well, not, okay, upset might be the wrong word to use, but definitely mourning, grieving. And in a way, that's part of the fun of role-playing. It's why we listen to sad songs. We like to feel sad and then be able to come out of it. We like to be able to express our emotions without the risk. Similar to role-playing as well. This will happen to a lot of people, even people for whom they shouldn't necessarily be like, I will never love in a role-playing game again, even though it hurt them when a role-playing experience happened and then fell apart. It is natural. It is okay to feel things. But if you know it's going to be too much for you, then you shouldn't. Kate says, we promise we aren't just making NPCs to boink PCs. That is absolutely the case. I've said this before in my own kind of game prep. We might have to do 2 episodes on this shit. We got a lot of questions and we haven't even got to some of them yet. I have, in my role-playing experience, I do not create characters and be like, this is designed to be your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your NB friend or whatever. I create characters. I find out whether there's any kind of romantic interest or a spark, and then I see if things will go from there, because I think that's more fun. I definitely don't like the idea of creating a character and being like, no, this is who your love interest is. Because what if the person doesn't like that character? Or what if the person realizes about their character something that they didn't realize beforehand? In Full Party, 3 of the 4 players came to me before game and said, I think I want my character to be asexual. And by the end of that campaign, we kind of had something going between 2 of those characters. It wasn't necessarily conventional, but there was definitely some elements of romance or sex that were involved, and yet still potentially on the ace spectrum. You don't necessarily know where you're going to go, because all 3 of these people said, I think maybe I'm just not going to get involved in romance this game. And then 2 of them kind of did. Not fully, but kind of did. So you don't necessarily know. You might start playing a character and then realize halfway through, I didn't realize my character was gay, but they're gay. And that's fine too. But it would really suck if I said, well, the only love interest I created for you, now you're incompatible with, and I'm not making another one. So we have that too. So Ellie, I'm forced to ask, watching these streams really helped me remember that John is not a female raccoon millionaire. I'm not sure if I should take this in a good way or a bad way. Like, is this wrecking your experience, or is this enhancing it, or which way? Like, is it destroying the illusions? Do I need to become a female raccoon millionaire? Eyes of Light. You wanna mention why you're hinting at Eyes of Light? Eyes of Light was definitely not created to be a love interest. Absolutely not. In here, I would prefer that you answer the question honestly, Ellie Spot, because I imagine there's people here who do not play in this Concordia and may not understand. Immersion ruined! Kate says, I've seen a few shows recently actually finally handle a bisexual character properly, which has been such a breath of fresh air after I kissed a guy, guess I'm gay now. I think, like, it is honestly really nice to see that, because bi erasure is a real thing, folks. It's very nice to see, and it's even happening also in the context of shows that are even driven towards bro culture, and I think that we need more of that. We absolutely need more of that. Thanks so much for that. That's really appreciated. For the follow, Fried One. But at any rate, crack. Yep, Freddie Mercury is bi-erased so much. That's absolutely true. The Freddie Mercury is just because Freddie Mercury may have enjoyed the company of other men does not mean that he was gay. So Gillard Good, Isolite was created already fairly much in love with one of the characters, not in a relationship. It didn't take long for one to start. Isolite was created as somebody who was crushing on... So technically wasn't created to be like, I'm creating somebody to crush on Jorik, and that's their purpose for being in the game. Isolite had more to her than that. But also, I didn't create her to be the love interest. She had other elements of the game that was important, but also I was not presenting this character and being like, here you are, Scott. Here is the character that you are allowed to romance. There are no other romances possible. Hell, I have created NPCs that have been like, oh, I think you're just great, but turned the fuck down. Go look up Pork. At any rate. Let's make sure that this gets thrown up there because I think it's important. Yes, and as Kung Fu Center says, it depends on when I made Isolite, not necessarily when they arrived. But I also don't think, Gil, that you're accusing me of doing something wrong. Bisexual erasure is when someone who's bi, but in a relationship, is assumed to be the sexuality represented by that pairing. So, for instance, if you are bisexual, but you are, say you are female identifying and you are in a relationship with someone who is male identifying, then the assumption is that they're straight and that they're not actually bi. They might have been curious, but whatever. Or if they're involved in a same-sex relationship, then they must be gay, not bi. You're allowed to find a partner, the partner you want to be with, but that doesn't mean that you aren't still attracted to somebody else entirely. And then we can also get into the whole aspect of what's the difference between someone's sexuality, but also someone's romanticism, because you can be, for instance, hetero-romantic, but homosexual. It's possible that you want to engage in romance with somebody of an opposite gender, but you're only interested in sex with somebody who's of the same. It gets complicated. I'm not the guy to ask. Go ask people who are better informed and better educated and who potentially represent these groups, because I am not that person. The date's what killed it. She was DTF until he tried to be romantic and kind of sucked. Her sexuality was competence. See, and I think that's an excellent thing. It is also important for me to note, and we will potentially get into this. I think we're going to have to extend this by at least a week because there's just so much to talk about. That it's okay for your relationships to end, including in a role-playing game. And it's okay for not every relationship to work out. If it was always the first person you hit on, perfect partner, not a problem, maybe that's the kind of game you want to play. You want to engage in that kind of fantasy? That's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Games are also fantasy. It's not necessarily creepy in a movie for somebody to stand outside your bedroom window holding a boombox over their head. In real life, that would be very creepy. In the same context of role-playing games, in Disconcordia, technically, everybody in Disconcordia have basically known each other for less than a month or around 1 month. And yet we already have people who are like expressing undying loyalty, friendship, love, but it's a fantasy. It's okay to get involved in that fantasy and to take it to that kind of fantastical heights. But it's also okay, and sometimes can make relationships even more worth it if some of them don't work out. If it's not, oh, my partner will be perfect for me at all times, but I searched and I searched and I eventually found the one. So there's that. So Ellie Spot says, I mean, I'm mostly joking. I don't generally have a hard time separating player from character. I think playing against a character that is so obviously not a normal human makes it easier to separate. But I think I'm definitely daring to go further because I know you are very different from the character. Also, I am lesbian, which further makes it easier to separate, which makes me dare going further as well. And I think that's entirely fair. I am not a woman. I am not bisexual, and I am not gay. And yet at the same time, that also provides me with an experience that I think is interesting, but also a level of separation that I can handle as well. So it is a thing. The other thing is that if you look at every post that I make on Disconcordia, my face is right there. So that makes a difference. Pukajutsu weighs in and says, Ellie Spot, I think that's something that I hadn't considered, that the separation might be easier because the characters aren't completely human, but that works for me too. Absolutely. We find the levels of separation that we're looking for, and those can often be quite useful. I'm playing a woman, but I'm not a woman. I don't identify as a woman. That's a layer of separation. We're playing in the year 2014. Okay, well, it's 20,000 years in the future, 18,000 years in the future. That's far enough removed for me. I am playing a kobold as opposed to a human. That's a layer of separation. All of these are valid. And you can find the separations where you need them in order to keep yourself safe and still have fun. Because the fun is important. The fun is interesting. There are elements to all of my characters that are part of me, and there's elements of my characters that are absolutely not. And that's just something that we live with. It's also one layer of separation that you might be able to have if you are playing with me is that a lot of people have seen me play and seen me play relationships with different people, and not all of these characters are the same. So there is a certain element of like, okay, this isn't engaging in a romantic relationship with John, because I've now played enough characters that it's kind of hard to tell what actually am I into or not, right? Like if one of my characters is somebody who's very timid, very shy, and another one of my characters is very gregarious and outgoing, and another one of my characters is aloof, well, which one is me? Maybe all of them, maybe none of them. But that is another layer of separation. I just played a lot of things, and I've had a lot of sex online, apparently. On camera. Right there. Let's go. Ellie says, if I was role-playing against Liz playing a very relatable human character that was close to Liz herself, I would not go as far, I think. And I think that's absolutely okay. That's fine. I know that there are some people who are purists out there and say, well, it shouldn't matter who's playing the character. But it does matter. It absolutely does matter. It makes a difference. At one point, I was in a LARP, and I ended up playing a character's mother. I ended up playing a character's wife briefly in like a phone conversation. And then afterwards he came to me and said, like, I don't want you to play my wife. I want her. And he indicated a member of the storytelling staff who identified as female. I want her to play my wife because it's just weird when I hear it from you. And at first I was like offended almost, being like, what the hell? Like I wasn't even trying to like engage in any romance. It was like you called your wife and I answered it. That's strange and odd. And then afterwards I was like, oh, I think that you're just doing it because you like the idea of being married to her because you can see her as a woman as opposed to me, who you can't see as a woman. And then afterwards I realized that it didn't really matter. It wasn't something that, like, in all honesty, there's a part of me that's like, I think that you wanted this because you just had that kind of squicky, I don't want to be in a relationship with a dude, but whatever, that's on him. I don't care. But it absolutely does make a difference when hitting, look, let me put it this way. There are jokes about me and Scott, shipping me and Scott all the time. It happens a lot. And maybe people are more comfortable making those jokes, believing that there's a level of separation there because neither Scott nor I have expressed interest in men. And so therefore it's easier to make that joke because, hey, Shadowgat the Black. So it's very easy for us to make those jokes and for us to laugh about them. But would there be as many of those jokes if people were shipping me and Elizabeth in front of our respective partners? Now, people make those jokes about our characters, but that's a level of separation that we can handle. But they don't make as many of those jokes about me and Liz, because there is something to think about. And it's in much the same way that in role-playing, you may be more comfortable flirting or engaging in relationship play or sexual play with somebody who is outside your standard attraction zone, because there is a level of separation that you can deal with. And that's okay too. In much the same way that you could be the sort of person who's like, I'm only interested in role-playing characters of my gender or of my sexuality. And I'm like, great, that's fine. If that's what interests you, exploring stuff that's you, I think that's worthwhile. And there are some people who say, I'm only interested in exploring things that are not me. And I'm like, great, if that's what you want, go for it as well. All of those things are fantastic. It just matters what you want for yourself. Because I have played the gamut and I enjoy the gamut. I like being able to experience lots of different things, even if I can't necessarily say I know what it is to be all, like I don't. But it interests me to play in different relationships as different characters and find out how each of them are different, including their sexual relationships. But that's my situation. Does not have to be yours. So if you're looking for creative RPG streams, this is a stream that we hold every week. We normally take questions and talk about various role-playing topics. Today we're talking about sex and relationships in terms of role-playing, so it's kind of a special one. We might be doing it next week. In fact, seeing that it's almost 6:30, I'm willing to make the call. We absolutely will, because we just got too much to talk about and haven't even gotten to a lot of what we're talking about here. So that's that. Requiem Lost says, I will say that I would be uncomfortable if I had a character in a romantic relationship with any of the storyteller NPCs, only because I see you guys stream, I know your faces, and I feel that I'm lacking that separation. Other PCs, I don't know their face much of the time, and there is that level of separation, and I think that is completely valid. Absolutely. It's that you find the separation that you're going to need and that will still let you enjoy what's going on. I would not be insulted if you were like, dude, I love your character, but I can't fuck her because all I'm thinking of is your face. Okay, that's the way you play. That is fine. It does not make you a better or worse role player. It means that you're the role player in that moment who isn't banging my character. That's all it is. In much the same way that if I was casting in a play and I'm like, look, I would think that you would make, like, you're a fine actor, but you are not the actor for this part. That's the way it goes. And the reason can be as simple as, I really saw this character as being, 3 centimeters taller than you. Sorry. And I can't control my height. Too bad, so sad. I was really hoping to get somebody with green eyes instead of brown eyes. Well, that sucks. You could be the best actor in the world, but you're not getting the part because of something in your genetics that you can't control. C'est la vie. It is one of the only jobs in the world, or not in the world, I shouldn't say that. It is one of the only jobs, at least in Canada, where you are legally allowed to discriminate somebody based on their appearance, based on their apparent gender, based on their voice, because you could say they weren't right for the part. And that's valid. You're not allowed to not hire somebody based on their appearance for other jobs, but for this one you can. Same thing in role-playing. It's totally fine. Have we talked about PC-NPC interaction? We could get to that at this point. We might as well. We've got some other things to talk about. Yeah, so also on Sundays, that's right, we run Exalted. We're using the Exalted Essence role-playing rules right now. We've been running it for a little while. We were over 30 episodes into this season, 11 episodes into this season, but another 20 episodes in the previous season. So yeah, it's long. We got a lot. Games are long. And I appreciate the bits, by the way, especially certain numbers of bits. That is definitely appreciated. So yeah, that's that's a lot. I'm actually going to hold Lemon Eater's question that was proposed in Discord. I'm going to hold that for next week, because then it'll give some more people a chance to, because it's specifically about what happened in the most recent Exalt Twitch Academy stream, and it'll give some more people a chance to catch up before I answer that, even though I don't think we're going to go into too much of spoiler territory for it. But here, you know what? And we'll also hold on to Avatar of Kane's questions for next week as well. Sorry if I didn't get to yours. But like, the thing is, it's such a great topic that I kind of want to make sure that we have the time to discuss it. Written as Wrote asked, in which ways, if any, is it desirable or helpful to talk about sexual health? STIs, sexually transmitted infections, get passed off as a joke that don't get mentioned in most campaigns. The same goes for infertility, any kind of dysfunction, and even attitudes to people with low libido. Can a game cover the stigmas and facts around these while remaining fun or relevant? Yes, depending on your group. As with everything, caution, especially because these are fraught topics. Sex is a fraught topic, but infections can be a fraught topic. There are stigmas surrounding STIs, low libido, infertility, impotence, erectile dysfunction, all of those things. And you don't necessarily know everybody's sexual history at the table. If everybody's making jokes about somebody who can't get it up, and you have somebody at the table who is legitimately struggling with erectile dysfunction, that's going to suck. And I can't tell you, never make jokes about anything. I don't think humor necessarily works that way. I do think that people definitely have the right to be offended by jokes. I think that people also have the right to make jokes, because you're allowed to be an asshole, but people don't necessarily have to listen to you at that point. So I'm not somebody who's like, everything should be funny. Like, I think that anything could be funny, but not everything is going to be funny to everybody at all times, and that doesn't make it okay to joke about everything at all times either. So, for instance, yeah, Kate has an example. I have a rule about pregnancy in my games. Every single character in my games, no matter what, has something that was actually granted as an item or as a merit in Exalted, which I believe was called selective consumption. I forget exactly what it is, what the name is, but the idea that you can control whether or not your character can either become pregnant or impregnate someone else. Because I don't like the idea that I can be like, haha, you had sex? Well, consequences. And because these are consequences that are, for some, really interesting to play with. And for others, dangerous to play with, or just to the point where they don't want to. Yeah, it might not be consumption. It's something else. I forget what it is exactly. It's a thing. Conception? Is it conception? Because I'm not sure it's conception either. Might be. Anyway. I thought that was, I seemed to recall that it was something weird instead of the actual word I would have picked. So good. If you found it, great. And that's the important thing. The main reason is that different people react to pregnancy in different ways, and I don't necessarily want to be like, your character engaged in romance, and now your character is pregnant, because let's role play a serious life situation where maybe your character's like, but I thought we used adequate family planning and birth control, and now I'm pregnant, and does that mean that I can't go and kill the wizard? Different people have different opinions on this. I will, however, let players say, I'm okay with the idea of becoming pregnant, but I'm not sure if that's where we're going to go at this time. That's okay too. It's completely okay. The idea that you want to explore that can be a lot of fun, but it's something that you have to opt into, in my games at least. And I think that the same would be for elements of sexual health. I don't think that it would be fun for me personally, to come up to somebody and say like, haha, you had sex? Well, guess what? Now you have chlamydia. And I don't really think that's funny. I usually get uncomfortable with the idea of somebody making fun of a sexually transmitted infection, because most people who get sexually transmitted infections, or rather I should say all people, no, it is actually most people. Most people who get a sexually transmitted infection wasn't looking to get it. And yes, for some people, it's because they were engaged in unsafe habits, but being unsafe doesn't necessarily mean that you're ready for ridicule. For some people, it's straight up lack of education. And for some people, it's straight up bad luck. You can take every precaution possible, but you can still get a sexually transmitted infection. Even if you're like, but we used condoms and I got tested and they got tested, like, it happens. It's fine. Guess what? A lot of you out there, a lot of you have sexually transmitted infection and you don't know about it because you're asymptomatic and it will probably never affect your life at all, but you still have it. So you got to deal with it. And I think that Kate's got the answer. So we're just going to throw that up there because honestly, why should I give the answer if somebody has put it more intelligently? It's really a question of what the table considers fun. It's a session zero talk. If sex having consequences is of interest to the whole table, great. Otherwise, it's assumed that the precautions are met and that random chance doesn't end up causing a problem later on. Because I do think that there are games out there, absolutely, where that kind of grittiness is going to be really like cool. And by gritty, I don't necessarily mean gritty during sex. Although the idea of somebody going after the NHL mascot Gritty and having sex with him is amazing. But there are elements that some people will want to play with these elements in their game, and that's great. But I think that that's really an opt-in. Let's see what other people say. Requiem Law says, I would hate to be in a game playing a female character and suddenly the storyteller being like, well, you're pregnant now, or a male character and much the same thing happens. Well, a girl you slept with, she's pregnant now. Like, part of it is that when we roleplay, we're roleplaying for certain experiences, and certain experiences we don't want. For some people, this is something that has happened in their life, either pregnancy scares or they've carried the pregnancy to term. They've accidentally fathered a child. All of these things are actually things that happen. But in much the same way that I don't like to roleplay, and for somebody to say, great, so we're going to roleplay, and for the next 3 hours, we're going to talk about you dealing with spreadsheets all day. Because I could say, but that's what I did all day. I looked at spreadsheets. So some people don't necessarily want to be confronted with real problems that they can have, and some people do. So you got to find that out. Ellie says, also, a lot of people have either abortion or pregnancy scares. So it's basically, yeah. A lot of people have either abortion or pregnancy scares or infertility histories that they don't talk about. I don't think you should force everyone to be open about those things at a role-playing table, since it can be really deep taboos. I also think that people have the right to have their secrets. Absolutely. I think that this has got to be more of an opt-in situation. And if somebody doesn't want to opt in, you don't need to dig deep as to why. You just got to be like, okay, that's cool. If you say that you don't want spiders in your role-playing game, I'm not going to come up to you and be like, why? Was it because a spider did something to you in the past? Tell me all about your fear of spiders. In much the same way that if someone says, I just don't want to deal with pregnancy in this game, I could be like, cool. And I don't have to be like, why? Is it because you are A, B, C, D, E, F, G? It's not my fucking business. If you feel like you want to tell me, then that's fine. We can talk about it. But role-playing is not an excuse for me to discover all of the things in your past, all of the things that you may or may not want to talk about. This is absolutely true. And just something that we have to deal with. Hey, Trey Dog. It's good to see you. Yeah. It's Gritty has side gals and guys. Gritty's got all the guys. Yes, and the other thing is that in terms of sex, pregnancy, STIs, it's a really heavy subject for a lot of people. Some people who try all their lives to get pregnant and can't. Some people who definitely do not want kids and end up with kids. Some people who have become pregnant and decided to terminate the pregnancy. Some people who have strong religious convictions about one way or the other, about all of these topics. It is a dangerous thing to bring up. It doesn't mean that it doesn't belong in your role-playing game. It means you got to proceed with extreme caution, and you have to be very careful as you are going through it to make sure that everybody's needs are being accommodated and to check in every once in a while to make sure that that's still the case. I remember in one of my campaigns that one character wanted to become pregnant, did, and then another player suggested, well, can we skip forward 9 months because it wouldn't be safe for this person to be engaged in, like high risk fantasy combat while pregnant. And this person whipped her head around and was like, no, I can be pregnant and I can be fighting all I want. And the first player, who was male, was just like, whoa, okay, whatever. And then we ended up playing through the 9 months of this person's pregnancy. It ended up being interesting. The kid grew up, and this was a long-running campaign. Worked out, but it won't work out for every group. So it is something that we have to be careful of. Kate says, so in summary, sex's consequences are big old triggers, so good to just leave them out unless everyone wants them. You are also allowed, if this is something that you're like, I specifically want to play a game that talks about STIs, if that's something that you want to do, make it clear up front, and people are allowed to opt out. They can just be like, nope, not the game I want to play, and that's great. It's sort of like how when you if you want to play on Disconcordia with us, if you want to play Changeling with us on Discord, we have a player's guide. The player's guide says there's going to be violence and there's going to be relationships and there will be sex. Is that going to be a problem? And if you're like, I don't like one of those things, then you shouldn't play. And I won't feel insulted and I won't say that you're a bad person. But I'm also not going to apologize for those things being in the game. That's just what we've done. Now, Disconcordia is not a game about STIs. So there is that. But these are all elements that we have to take into account. But speaking of, even though we're probably going to get into this topic next week, I feel like I would be remiss if we didn't discuss what's happening right now in Disconcordia in terms of relationships and sex, because it is important to go into. There is specific design issues with relationships in role-playing and sex in role-playing that we have to encounter and come up with. The first is there can be a problem with isolation. So one of the issues that we ran into with Disconcordia is that we've had a few people request, hey, can we create extra rooms to play in, extra spaces? Like, can we have like the park that's across the street? Can we have my house where I can invite people to come in and hang out with me? And we've actually said no. And part of the reason why we've said no is because we don't want to make it easy for players to say, I will spend time over here, and therefore I have no excuse to run into other characters. It means that people aren't given a chance to mix. The way that the rooms are laid out in the game right now is that most rooms lead from one room to another room. So even if you're just running into one room, you have to pass through a room where other people may be in, which encourages character interaction and keeps the game fresh, because otherwise you'll get a situation where you hang out only with the people you talk to, and that's it. And you don't talk to anybody else. And then instead of running one big game, you're running 10 or 15 small games with everybody sort of dotted around, and it becomes a lot less interesting and more stagnant. And not to mention kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. So that is something that we have as an issue, but it's also an issue if you enter into a game and it seems like it is speedrunning any percent soiling the office. That can be an issue as well. Because then for some people, they'll feel like it is a requirement for them to be in a relationship. If you're not in a relationship, then you're nobody. For some people, they start worrying, oh, I don't want to talk to this person because they're in a relationship and I don't want to interrupt them talking to their character's partner. These are all things that we actually have run into. There are people who ask like, oh, I don't, is it okay if I bring my character in because then I'd be cock blocking? And while it is true that sometimes it's like, you know what, let these characters just like, it's okay to sometimes be like, no, these two characters want to talk to each other alone in private, let them. But we also don't want that to necessarily be the overwhelming, this is what's happening in the game all the time. All it is Too Hot to Handle Changeling Edition. So there is that. And see, like Requiem, so when you say the channel you set up for my character and her partner was literally just turned into our text history, that's correct. And that's what we intend. If it was the channel where you and your character would just go and talk to each other all the time, we'd probably disable the channel after a while, because we want your characters to be involved in the whole game. Some private conversations are fine, but if we notice that all you were doing was just having an excuse to run off and like just roleplay with one other person, that's no good in a mass game. And this extends to tabletop as well. If you have two PCs who are engaged in a relationship and all they ever do is want to engage in that relationship, and then every other player is just like, well, we're either advancing the plot or we're watching these two talk about how they want to fuck all the time, it slows the game down. It stagnates because players tend to focus on their story and their own interests, and they don't necessarily care about the other players at the table. Now, they should, and we should encourage that behavior, but it's not the first thing on their mind. So this is part of the reason why the joke right now in this mass Discord game that we have is that people are trying to find places to have sex, but there aren't private places for most people to have sex in the game. And that's intentional. It's to make sure that your characters can't just focus on their relationship to the exclusion of all other things. That's important to us. The second thing that is important is we want to make sure that your characters are not locked to one other person in the relationship either. And that's harder for us to control because I can't walk up to two players and say like, break up because you're spending too much time together. Like, that's lame. But we do then enter into a situation where I don't want somebody to be like, well, I'm not in a relationship and everyone else is, so what do I do? Nor do I want to get into a situation where someone says, well, I'm in a relationship with an NPC, and that NPC therefore can't talk to anyone else because they're my character's relationship. It would get very, very tiring very, very fast, also especially depending on the NPC. One of the NPCs that I run is the freeholder of this game, which basically means that the building in which everybody gathers, it's her building. She's in charge, nominally. It's a bit more complicated than that, but there are reasons for everybody to want to talk to her at one point or another, and it would be super lame if the only time that I ever brought this character in was so that she could engage in romantic conversations with whatever NPCs or PCs she wanted to talk about or talk to. That would be unfair to most of the other players and also create a poor narrative at this point, right? So that's something that we have to look at as well. How can people be good players going forward about sex, especially in the context of a mass game, but also in terms of a tabletop game? We're going to get more in depth on this next week, but for now, I can say this. The first is, if your character is if you only ever have your character show up in order to engage in romance, and you find that you are excluding every other kind of interaction you can have in the game, I would argue that then you are probably not playing in the spirit that the game intends. Wow, I've swallowed something that I should not have. So, what I mean by that is, let's say we'll use Alice and Bob again because they're useful. Where did our lovely Puka Freeholder went? Well, 80 Sassery, if you join Disconcordia, you can find out what happens after CTS ended. Because, yeah, I'm not sure which Puka Freeholder you're talking about. because there wasn't one in CTS that I can remember off the top of my head. At any rate, there were knockers, Sister Flex, but he was a knocker, not a puka. You can find out how he is, potentially. So if you're finding that you're joining in and you're like, I don't want to talk to anybody else except for Alice joins the server. Alice starts playing. Alice meets Bob. Alice and Bob enter into a relationship. Alice, from then on, avoids talking to anybody except Bob. Only wants to talk to Bob. Only ever wants to talk about their relationship with Bob. Only ever wants to like role play the silly romance or the like down and dirty with Bob. I would say, Alice, you are no longer playing the game with everyone. Now you are just role playing with Bob. And that's not what we intend. And you are, in fact, contributing to the idea of isolation and making the server not even less big. I shouldn't be closing them in. I should be like of opening things up too wide, because you are no longer actually bouncing into anybody. You're no longer reacting to them. So that's an issue. I don't want to say you can't, engage in your relationships. Absolutely, go for it. But make your character available. In much the same way that if you're engaged in a role-playing relationship at a tabletop game, if all you do is turn to the person who is sitting to your left or your right, and you're only talking to them, and you're kind of ignoring everybody else, and when it comes to like the rest of the game, you're just like, whatever, I rolled dice, a 7. So anyway, do you come here often? Like, that's equally disrespectful of everyone else at the table, because the game is meant to be a communal storytelling experience, and you're shutting out other people from that storytelling, at which point you should do that on your own time, on your own space, with other people. And that would be fine. So I don't want people to feel like I'm coming down on somebody being in a relationship in game, because I'm not. I think it's great, and I think it's one of the things that can really make playing online fun, because you actually have a wide pool of people to pick from. Nor do I also want to come down on somebody who's like, yes, my character has fallen deeply in love, is ready to get married right now, even though I've only known this person for like 3 days. Again, it's a fantasy. You're allowed to engage in fantasy behavior. It's okay. But there's a whole game out there. There are a lot of players out there. And one of the things that we do, if you join this server, every single player is asked to swear an oath at the beginning before they're allowed to bring their character in, which specifically states that I will do my best to make this game fun for everyone. And if they don't, the dreaming will fry their Discord connection. So it's a thing that I ask everybody to do, and I don't know how seriously everybody takes it, but I do. I take it very seriously. If you are not attempting to make the game fun for everybody, then I don't want you to play. Pure and simple. It is not your responsibility to go and seek out every other player and make sure that you interact with them. That's not what I'm saying. It is not your responsibility to make sure that your character is nice to everybody else, because also sometimes not being nice makes the game more fun. Just ask some of the characters that we have on that server. What I am asking for, though, is that you appreciate the fact that if all you are doing is tying yourself up to one thing, you're closing yourself off, and you have so much more to contribute to the game than just that one relationship. Everybody has more to contribute than just that, and that's what they should do. So there is that to keep in mind. The other thing that I will say is, if you are in a relationship in this game, don't feel you have to stay in it. Just don't. If it's no longer interesting for you to play, or if things have happened that means that your character would end the relationship, that's okay. We'll talk next week about what it's like to have a relationship in game, the shortcuts, the shorthands that we use, the fact that we don't role play through all the aspects of that relationship and how that changes the dynamic, and what it means if your character is in a toxic relationship and how that can affect your enjoyment of the game, as well as how much it can bleed into real life. We'll get into all of that next week, but I will just, as an appeal to anybody watching this, you don't have to stay in a relationship. You don't have to worry about whether or not you're going to upset the other player. One of the wonderful things and one of the awful things about romance, love, lust, and sex is that it means we must be vulnerable. We must be vulnerable. And therefore, we also have to open to ourselves to get hurt. I would say that if you are playing with somebody and you said, well, our characters have to break up, and then they got upset about it and was like, but that's not okay for me. If somebody decided that they needed to say, no, our characters had to be in a relationship because otherwise I'm not enjoying it, or even worse, you're not allowed to break up with me because that would upset me. Well, here's the other thing about safety cards. Safety cards are not a I get what I want card. They are a I have to communicate my needs, desires, consent, and want. But you don't necessarily get to dictate what other players get to do. So, thank you, Kung Fu Fenris. That's appreciated. And Ellie Spotted, we're going to get to that point because it's very good. Do not worry about the other player. If you don't want to be in the relationship anymore, don't be. It's fine. And also, it can honestly make for a great role-playing experience for people to go through breakups too. It's another way to learn about romance and life and love and sex, is what happens when it ends. But we will get to that later on. I'm going to highlight, though, what Ellie Spot has said, because I think it's a great way for us to sort of go in on the end. There have been so many fun scenes where characters are just going to other characters talking about what happened with their romantic partner. Yeah, your romance also doesn't have to involve just the two of you. The effects of your romance can expand beyond the people who are involved. And I don't necessarily mean that this means polyamory or the like, although it can if you want it to. That's totally fine. But just having your relationship be a part of the game as opposed to your relationship being something private. This is also why some of the comments that we've had in our Out of Character channel, some of the most compelling reading that we've seen is when we have two people who are daring to have conversations about their relationship, or even things getting hot and heavy in a place where other people can see. That's why I think I'd be upset if people just started only doing things in private rooms, because then it robs the rest of us of being able to enjoy, much like at a table. If two people, whether they're storyteller characters, NPCs, or PCs, when two people are engaged in a relationship, hopefully everyone can enjoy that relationship instead of just the two of you. So, it's a thing. Tomorrow, over on twitch.tv/Elizabeth A. Neal, there will be, I believe, more Punch. Oh, no, there will not. There will definitely not be Punch Effect, but I believe Scott might be streaming. So you'll have to pay attention to that. That'll be on our Discord. I'm sure that Scott will let you know. There could be a Steel stream either from Scott or from somebody else. We will make sure that that's clear. Also, there will potentially be Drew Crew, and maybe Scott will have decided what he's going to do next for Doomed on Saturday. But that, again, just keep it in mind. Elizabeth's been on set recently, which is very cool, but sets do not have what we would call set schedules the way that we would like. But on Sunday, 6 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, just come back, join us for Exalt Twitch Academy. We would love to have you, especially considering what happened last episode. I think it's going to shake things up, something that we've never had happen in RPG Clinic history, and it would be very cool to see. No, sets have schedules, and schedules get tossed right out the fucking window. So that's the way it is. In the meantime, though, when it comes to sex in your role-playing games or in real life and your relationships, it might not be the easy thing, but trust me, things can get a lot better if you just use your word hole. We'll see you next time.